Autumn 1777. A British general stands at the edge of his camp in upstate New York and stares south. Somewhere in those trees is an army he cannot beat and a road he cannot take. His name is Lieutenant General John Burgoyne. Gentleman Johnny, they called him. Part soldiers, part politician, part playwright, and a man who enjoyed his comforts. He was charming, verbose, and genuinely brave in battle. He was also in the autumn of 1777 watching his own catastrophe arrive in slow motion. In June, he came south from Canada with nearly 8,000 men and a promise, shared enthusiastically by King George himself, that the American rebellion would end before Christmas. Well, it is now October 7th. He has approximately 5,000 effective soldiers left. His supply wagons are nearly empty. The reinforcement he was promised never came, and in the next 12 hours, his offensive will collapse completely. Within 10 days, he will surrender an entire British army on the banks of the Hudson River. The first time in the history of the British Empire that a field army has surrendered intact to an enemy force. The historian Edmund Morgan put it plainly. Saratoga was a great turning point of the war because it won for Americans the foreign assistance that was the last element needed for victory. This is the story of how that happened, how the most ambitious British campaign of the Revolution unraveled mile by mile through the forests of New York, how a Polish engineer, a Virginia rifleman, and a deeply compromised general named Gates-Arnold changed the course of the war, and arguably the course of the modern world. I am Benito, and this is the Jacked Historian. The war had begun 2 years earlier, in 1775, with shots at Lexington and Concord. The background was a decade of escalating friction. Britain, having won a world war in 1763 and taken on enormous debt, turned to its American colonies for revenue. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Duties, the Tea Act. The colonies, long used to self-governance through local assemblies, found themselves taxed by a parliament where they had no representation. Boycotts escalated to flashpoints: the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, the Punishing Intolerable Acts. By spring 1775, the argument had become a war. The Second Continental Congress named George Washington to command a Continental Army. Thomas Paine's common sense reframed the conflict from a tax dispute to a question of sovereignty. And on July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence made this explicit. This was about whether 13 colonies would become a free and independent nation. Britain entered the conflict confident. The most powerful navy in the world, seasoned regulars, controls of the major port cities. America's strengths were different. Home ground, a sprawling interior that could absorb defeats, and a political movement with enough ideological energy to replace broken armies with new volunteers. While the British thought they could win battles and take cities, what they could not do was extinguish a rebellion simply by winning battles and taking cities. Washington's strategy was to survive, to keep an army in the field, and to wait for a great power, a patron, to change the odds. France was the patron he was waiting for. Humiliated in the 7 Years' War, stripped of Canada and much of its colonial empire, France's foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, had been funneling covert military supplies to the Americans since 1776. Through a fictitious trading company run by the playwright-turned-arms dealer Beaumarchais. But open alliance required proof that the Americans could actually win. Vergennes was not going to commit France to a war on behalf of a rebellion that would collapse. He was waiting for exactly the kind of event that Saratoga would eventually provide. By the spring of 1777, Britain held New York City, but had been unable to deliver a decisive blow. The Hudson River, running from the Canadian border south through Albany to New York Harbor, looked like the solution. It was the north-south highway of eastern North America. Whoever controlled it split the continent in two. New England, the political heart of the rebellion and the primary source of Washington's manpower, could be severed from the middle and southern colonies. General John Burgoyne went to London in the winter of 1776 and 1777 and pitched the plan personally to the King and to the Secretary of State for America, Lord George Germain. Three forces converging on Albany, Burgoyne driving south from Canada through the Lake Champlain corridor, Colonel Barry St. Leger moving east through the Mohawk Valley, and General William Howe coming up the Hudson from New York City to meet them. Albany falls, the Hudson is sealed, New England is cut off. On a map in London, everything looked elegant. What followed is one of the great administrative disasters in military history. Germain approved Burgoyne's plan, then approved Howe's separate proposal to take Philadelphia instead, apparently without ever writing a single clear order putting the two plans together. Howe sailed south, won a Brandywine on September 11th, and captured the American capital, while Burgoyne marched south with no one coming to meet him. On June 17, 1777, roughly 7,200 men fit for duty left the Lake Champlain corridor. About 3,700 were British regulars, grenadier and light infantry battalions, plus line regiments including the 9th, the 20th, the 21st, the 24th, the 29th, the 31st, the 34th, 47th, 53rd, and 62nd regiments on foot. Another 3,000 men were German auxiliaries under Major General Friedrich Adolf von Riedisel, mostly Brunswickers, not Hessians, though Americans used the term interchangeably. They were hired soldiers from the Duchy of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, professional and capable. Several hundred Loyalist Rangers and Canadian militia marched with them, and approximately 400 indigenous warriors, primarily Mohawk, Seneca, Onondaga, and Cayuga, led in part by the Mohawk war leader Joseph Brant. The involvement of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Six Nations also called the Iroquois, was not incidental. The revolution split them. Joseph Brant's Mohawk, along with the Seneca, Onondaga, and Cayuga, sided with the Crown, the British, calculating that British power was the best protection against further American encroachment on their lands. The Oneida and Tuscarora sided largely with the Americans, a painful fracture within a confederacy that had held together for centuries. Then there was the baggage. Well, Burgoyne dragged over 130 pieces of artillery into the forests of New York, plus a famously elaborated personal train, wine, wardrobe, officer's family. Now, in a European campaign, artillery was indeed power. In the Hudson Valley wilderness, it was a burden. Everything that required a wagon needed oxen to pull it, roads to carry it, and time to move it. He was about to run out of all three. The campaign began so easily it may have misled him. Fort Ticonderoga, guarding the southern end of Lake Champlain, was held by General Arthur St. Clair with about 3,000 men. Burgoyne's engineers spotted what the Americans had dismissed, a height called Sugarloaf, today Mount Defiance, looming 750 feet above the fort's wall. For the Americans, it was too steep to matter. Burgoyne's engineer disagreed, and on July 5th and 6th, they hauled cannon to its crest. St. Clair looked up, saw artillery pointing down from a position he could not answer, and evacuated at night. The British walked in at dawn. King George reportedly burst into his wife's apartment celebrating, "I have beaten all the Americans." The wilderness to the south was unimpressed. General Philip Schuyler, commanding the American Northern Department, turned terrain into a weapon. His men felled trees across every road leading south, flooded low ground, smashed bridges, drove off livestock. Burgoyne's army crawled 20 miles in 20 days. Every hour of delay was a meal eaten, a horse weakened, a window for American reinforcements to arrive. On July 27th, an event on the road to Fort Edward changed the political weather. Jane McCrea, a young woman engaged to a loyalist officer in Burgoyne's forces, was killed by British allied warriors. The exact circumstances remain contested. Burgoyne sought punishment, then pulled back rather than lose indigenous allies he still needed. Patriot printers turned the story into war propaganda. A young American woman murdered by savages hired by a general who refused justice. But as an image carried through pamphlets, taverns, and sermons, it gave the war in the North a human face that recruitment notices never could. In the Mohawk Valley, one of the other British commanders, St. Leger, besieged Fort Stanwix, but its garrison refused to surrender. When a relief column of Oneida warriors and Patriot militia marched to help, Loyalist troops and Haudenosaunee warriors ambushed it at Oriskany on August 6, one of the bloodiest close-quarters fights of the entire war. Fort Stanwix still held. Benedict Arnold, who had volunteered to lead a relief force over the objections of a council of war, resorted to trickery. He had recently captured a loyalist soldier named Hon Jost Schuyler and now struck a deal. Spread false rumors that thousands of Continentals were closing in and his brother went free. The ruse worked. St. Leger's indigenous allies, already shaken by Oriskany, slipped away, and without them, the coalition collapsed. St. Leger retreat, reaching Ticonderoga too late to be of any use to Burgoyne. By mid-August, Burgoyne was short on horses and food. A supply depot near Bennington, Vermont, looked vulnerable. He dispatched Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum with roughly 700 men, Brunswick Dragoons, Loyalists, and militia to seize it. Waiting for them was Brigadier General John Stark, a New Hampshire veteran who knew every inch of the ground. On August 16, Stark sent columns around Baum's hilltop position from multiple sides. The fighting taking place at Walloomsac, New York, some 10 miles short of the depot itself. The Brunswick Dragoons fought hard but were overwhelmed. When Lieutenant Colonel Bremen arrived with reinforcement, he seemed headed for the same result, until Colonel Seth Warner rode with the Continental regulars and drove Bremen's men from the field entirely. By day's end, roughly 900 Crown troops were killed, wounded, or captured, against about 70 American casualties. Burgoyne had lost something close to 1/8 of his effective strength in a single afternoon, foraging for supplies he never got. On September 13th, Burgoyne crossed to the west bank of the Hudson at Saratoga and committed to pushing south. His supplies could not sustain a retreat to Canada. The only direction that made arithmetic sense was forward. Ahead of him, on a wooded plateau above the river, an American army was waiting and growing stronger every day. On this wooded plateau of Bemis Heights, the fate of an army rested not just on earth and artillery, but on the minds and courage of a few remarkable men. A young Polish engineer who turned the land itself into a fortress, A cautious general who trusted patience over impulse, a frontier sharpshooter with a personal score to settle, and a fiery officer who refused to be ignored. Each would shape the battle in ways the British never imagined. Tadeusz Kościuszko was just 31, yet he had already studied at the Royal Military Academy in Warsaw, Poland, and trained in France. At Bemis Heights, he saw what others did not. The land itself could be a weapon. He positioned artillery to cover the only road around the river, built redoubts across the plateau, and used ravines and forests to make flanking nearly impossible. Any British attack would have to climb into prepared fire. Kościuszko rarely gets credit in popular stories of Saratoga, but without his design, the battle might have gone very differently. Major General Horatio Gates took command of the Northern Army in mid-August with around 9,000 men. His plan was simple: make the British come to him. Fortifications were strong, the terrain was on his side, and every day of delay weakened Burgoyne's army. Critics called him timid, especially his subordinate Gates-Arnold. But Gates knew the power of patience, waiting. Letting the British tire and starve would turn time into a weapon. By the second battle, his numbers would swell to more than 12,000, ready to strike at the perfect moment. We have next Daniel Morgan. He was a man forged on the frontier. During the French and Indian War, he survived 499 lashes from a British drummer, one short of 500 because the drummer miscounted, a detail Morgan never forgot. He had fought at Quebec, been captured, exchanged, and returned to the fight with a personal score to settle. Washington picked him to lead 400 to 500 riflemen from Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. Unlike the British smoothbore musket, Morgan's long rifle could hit a target at 200 yards from behind cover. His men picked off officers with deadly precision, striking fear into British ranks far beyond the number of men on the field. Gates-Arnold had already made a name for himself at Quebec, on Lake Champlain, and in the Mohawk Valley. But Congress had passed him over again and again, promoting men he considered less capable. Furious, frustrated, and itching for action, he stayed. At Saratoga, he was unstoppable, leading charges, rallying troops, and throwing himself into danger. Militia and regulars alike followed him because he acted when others hesitated. His boldness, even if reckless, gave Gates' army the edge it needed at critical moments. Each of these men brought their own skill and drive to Saratoga. Together they turned a wooded plateau into a trap, forcing Burgoyne's army into a fight he could not win. By September 19th, Burgoyne had run out of good options. Provisions were dwindling, Gates' army was growing, and every day of delay worsened his position. He advanced. 3 columns, probing for the American left, General Simon Fraser, Burgoyne's most capable subordinate, a Scotsman who had led the advance corps throughout the campaign. He would take 2,000 men wide through the forest to the right, seeking high ground on the American flank. General Hamilton's center column, with Burgoyne himself, would push through the fields around Freeman's farm, an abandoned clearing hacked out of the forest by a loyalist who no longer farmed it. General von Riedisel would keep his German troops and artillery on the river road to the left, pinning the American right. Fraser's was by far the largest of the 3 forces, which made what happened next all the more costly. The forest around Bemis Heights was dense, second-growth woodland broken by ravines and undergrowth that swallowed formations and destroyed timing. Fraser never reached the battlefield at all. Around noon, Hamilton emerged into Freeman's farm, alone, and on the far side of that clearing, Morgan's men were already there. From the tree line, Morgan's rifle corps opened fire with aim shots at officers and NCOs. The effect was immediate. A British advance partly was shredded, survivors tumbling back into the main column. Morgan's men, overeager, pressed forward out of the trees and ran into the main British line in the open. The Rifle Corps was nearly destroyed in a counter volley. Morgan put a turkey call to his lips, his man's rally signal. They pulled back, and the battle settled into a grinding back and forth over several hours around the clearing. The American infantry surged from the woods, hit the British line where they were thrown back by volleys and bayonet charges, reformed in the trees and surged again. The unit taking the worst of it was the 62nd Regiment on foot, holding the center of Hamilton's line. By day's end, more than half of its men were dead or wounded, and it had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. British artillery fired at point-blank range into the woods. American riflemen shot the horses, then guns fell silent. Back at Bemis Heights, a separate battle was being fought between the two American generals. Gates held to his defensive plan. Arnold demanded full commitment. Pour everything in. Break Hamilton's column before Fraser could support it. Gates refused. The tension between them was personal, professional, and barely contained. Late in the afternoon, with Hamilton's line close to breaking, Burgoyne sent orders to Riedisel. Guard the baggage, but send every man you can spare toward the American right. It was a calculated risk, stripping the river road to save the center. Riedisel marched, and his Germans arrived at dusk. They struck the American right flank, the line steadied, and the Americans withdrew to Bemis Heights. Technically and tactically, this was a British success. Strategically, a failure. The road south was still blocked. The American works were still intact, and the prize was roughly 600 British and German casualties against around 350 Americans. Even Burgoyne acknowledged the success had been dearly bought. He had won a clearing in the forest. He had not advanced the campaign. The 3 weeks between the two battles mattered as much as either fight. Burgoyne waited for Clinton. Clinton did eventually push up the Hudson, but he was 100 miles too far south, and his message reached Burgoyne 2 days after the second battle was already over. The wait had cost everything. Inside the British camp, the arithmetic ran one way. Wounds, illness, and desertion thinned the ranks. Indigenous allies, reading the fortunes accurately, began quietly departing. Horses died. Foraging parties were ambushed. The mood can be read in the journal of Frederica von Riedisel, the Baroness, wife of the German general, who had followed her husband across the Atlantic with their 3 young daughters. She was 31 years old, keeping a daily record of a slow catastrophe. The breakdown of order, the mishandled food, the spreading misery, and the soldiers' fading belief that this was going to end well. The American camp, meanwhile, swelled toward 13,000 and kept growing, militia pouring in from New England and New York. By the second battle, Gates would outnumber Burgoyne roughly 2-1. Inside the American camp, the Gates-Arnold feud exploded into the open. Gates' official dispatch to Congress on Freeman's farm omitted Arnold's name entirely, attributing the day's fighting to Morgan and his riflemen. It was not inaccurate, it was unmistakably a slight. Arnold confronted Gates. Gates stripped him of field command. Arnold requested transfer to Washington's army and began packing. His officers wrote urging him to stay. The men who will fight the next battle trusted him in a way they trusted no one else. Arnold did not leave. He remained in his tent, stripped of command, for the better part of 2 weeks. On the evening of October 6th, General John Burgoyne gathered his officers and read the grim ledger aloud. 8 to 10 days of food remaining. fewer than 6,000 effectives left, Americans outnumbering him 2-1, and no sign of Clinton coming to the rescue in time. He pushed hard for a massive assault on the American left, but his generals refused. They couldn't see the enemy works clearly enough to plan it properly, and a failed attack would strip the camp of its defenders, exposing the wounded and the only line of retreat. The compromise was modest, born of desperation. A reconnaissance force in the next morning, about 1,500 picked men and 10 guns, would move out to forage, probe the American left for weaknesses, and seize any opening that appeared. The Americans saw it coming, almost immediately. Gates moved fast. Daniel Morgan's rifle corps swung wide to curl around the British right. General Enoch Poor's brigade slammed into the British left, where Major John Ackland Grenadiers held firm ground, fighting stubbornly until Ackland himself went down, shot through both legs. The Grenadiers began to bend. On the right, Morgan's men hit the British light infantry. Officers fell in the opening minutes, and the flank started to collapse. Into the crisis rode Brigadier General Simon Fraser, conspicuous on horseback, rallying his men by sheer force of presence. American tradition credits a specific marksman, often named as Timothy Murphy, with felling him from a tree, shooting from afar, at long range, after Morgan identified Fraser at the hinge holding the flank together. Modern historians treat that attribution with caution. The story appears late in the record, the ballistics are contested, and eyewitness accounts are inconsistent. What is not in dispute is this: Fraser was shot from his horse and mortally wounded. He was carried to the quarters of Baroness von Riedisel, where she and the other women nursed him through the night. He died the following morning, asking to be buried in the Great Redoubt of the Heights, a wish honored under the American fire the next day. When Fraser fell, the British right collapsed. And then Benedict Arnold came out from his tent. 10 days stripped of command, no authority over any unit on the field, explicit orders to stay out of the fight. He heard the guns. He mounted and rode toward the sound. Arnold arrived on the battlefield and began directing attacks with a speed that eyewitnesses on both sides described as extraordinary. Men followed him, partly because of who he was, partly because he was riding into the fight with the confidence of a man who believed they would win. Gates sent an officer to recall him. The order never caught up. One of the strongest positions anchoring the British camp was the Balcarres Redoubt, held by the Earl of Balcarres and his light infantry. Arnold drove attack after attack against it. The earthworks held. He pulled back, looking at the broader field, and saw something. Between Balcarres and Bremen Redoubt, at the far right of the British line, there was a gap, held by only a handful of Canadian and Loyalist troops. The Bremen Redoubt was the anchor of the entire British right. Arnold wheeled and drove a converging attack through that interval, hitting Bremen from front and rear simultaneously. Troops from Learn's brigade, Morgan's riflemen, and fresh Massachusetts regiments poured into the gap. Bremen fell into the fighting. The redoubt collapsed. The entire British right lay open. At the moment of the breakthrough, a musket ball struck Arnold's left leg, the same leg wounded at Quebec. His horse was hit and crashed down, shattering the bone beneath him. He refused amputation. He kept the leg. At Saratoga, the clash of weapons revealed one of the clearest technological edges of the Revolutionary War. British regulars carried the smoothbore musket, the famous Brown Bess. A fast-loading weapon, a trained soldier could fire 2 to 3 times per minute using a paper cartridge. Bite it open, prime the pan, pour the charge and ball, ram it home, cock, and fire. I care only for about 250 to 100 yards, and it was built for mass volleys and bayonet charges. In contrast, Morgan's Virginia and Pennsylvania riflemen carried the long Pennsylvania rifle, a rifled barrel weapon crafted by German immigrant gunsmiths. Loading was slower and more deliberate. Measure loose powder from a horn, seat a greased linen patch and smaller lead ball, then ram it tightly into the rifling, usually just one careful shot every 30 to 60 seconds, sometimes less once falling built up. Yet, the extra effort delivered devastating accuracy. The spinning bullet could strike a man-sized target reliably at 200 yards, with expert marksmen capable of effective fire out to 300 yards under good conditions. That night, Burgoyne's army began its painful retreat north, carrying its wounded, abandoning equipment it could no longer move. By October 8, cold rain had turned the roads to mud. The column halted near Saratoga, the very ground where the campaign had begun. American forces blocked the road north. Militia sealed the routes west. Artillery crowned the surrounding heights. Burgoyne's army was encircled. In the cellar of the Marshall House, Frederica von Riedisel sheltered with her 3 young daughters as cannonballs tore through the floors above. She wrote in her journal of the weeping of her children, of a soldier having his leg amputated on the kitchen table, only to lose the other to a shot that came crashing through the wall, of the women who nursed the wounded through what seemed an endless night. Her husband sent messengers from the lines to tell her he was still alive. She wrote that she was more dead than alive, not from their own danger, but from fear for what he was facing. On October 13th, Burgoyne called a final council of war. The arithmetic had only grown worse since the 7th. Desertions were accelerating. Every road was closed. Further resistance would mean only more dead. He wrote to Gates requesting negotiations. He insisted on calling it a convention rather than a surrender, a distinction that mattered deeply to him. Gates, holding every card, graciously allowed it. Under the Convention of Saratoga, Burgoyne's troops would march to Boston and return to Britain, on the condition they not serve again in North America. On October 17, 1777, approximately 6,000 British, German, and Loyalist soldiers marched out in full military order, drums beating, flags flying, the honors of war, and stacked their arms beside the Hudson River. American soldiers watched in silence and wrote home that it was a glorious sight to see the haughty British surrender to an army they had once despised. Burgoyne handed Gates his sword. Gates returned it with a bow. The two generals shared dinner. Congress ultimately refused on these terms, reasoning that honoring them would simply release 6,000 trained soldiers to fight elsewhere. The convention army spent the rest of the war in captivity, shuffled between camps in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Many died of disease. Many deserted and blended into American life, especially the German troops, who had no deep attachment to the British cause and found Pennsylvania and Virginia congenial. A substantial portion never went home at all. The Continental Congress declared December 18, 1777 a national day of thanksgiving and praise, the first official American observance under that name. 7 weeks after Burgoyne's surrender on the Hudson, a courier arrived in Paris. Benjamin Franklin had spent a year in France running one of history's most effective diplomatic campaigns. He understood that the powdered world of Versailles responded to images, and he had crafted one: the Republican simplicity of the New World. Plain coat, round spectacles, fur cap. French intellectuals adored him, society lionized him, yet charm alone was not enough. Valjean would not commit France to war based on dinner party charisma. He needed proof that the Americans could actually win. Saratoga provided it, not a mere tactical setback, but an entire British army surrendered. That single event reshaped calculations at Versailles. Rumors added urgency. Britain might offer the Americans a negotiated peace before France could act. Franklin did not wait for Spain. On February 6, 1778, Franklin, Celestine, and Arthur Lee signed two documents in Paris: the Treaty of Amity and Commerce and the Treaty of Alliance. France recognized American independence and pledged military support. The war changed overnight. France declared war on Britain the next month. Spain joined in 1779, the Netherlands in 1780. Britain, expecting a colonial police action, now faced three major European powers at once, fighting naval battles from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean and defending colonies at home waters across the globe. French support proved decisive. Loans kept the Continental Army paid when Congress could not. French officers, above all Lafayette, brought professional skill and political energy. And at Yorktown in October 1781, it was Admiral de Grassy's French fleet that sealed the outcome, blocking the Chesapeake and trapping Cornwallis. Without de Grassy, Cornwallis escaped. Without Yorktown, there is no Treaty of Paris. Saratoga did not end the war. 6 more years of fighting remained, but it killed the British strategy that had sent Burgoyne south in the first place. The Hudson Valley plan to isolate New England and crush the rebellion before Christmas was permanently discredited. What replaced it was the Southern strategy: shift the focus to the Carolinas and Georgia, where Loyalist sentiment was believed to be stronger. It produced its own brutal campaign: the fall of Savannah in 1778, the siege and surrender of Charleston in 1780, a catastrophic American defeat at Camden under the same Horatio Gates who had triumphed at Saratoga, and a vicious Loyalist-Patriot guerrilla war that scarred the region for a generation. British regulars won battles, but they could not convert them into control. Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and others made occupation of the countryside impossible. The rebellion kept raising new armies. At home, Saratoga galvanized the parliamentary opposition. Charles James Fox, Edmund Burke, and Lord Shelburne had argued against the war from the start. Now they had a disaster to point to. Lord North's government survived until 1782, but its authority never recovered. Public confidence that the war was winnable on acceptable terms was broken. Burgoyne returned to Britain under parole and spent years arguing that the campaign had been doomed by Howe's absence and Germain's incompetence. Historians have largely agreed on those structural failures, while noting that the excessive baggage, the delay at Ticonderoga and Bennington were his own mistakes. He died in 1792, never fully rehabilitated. The consequences of the American Revolution reached further. Kosciuszko returned to Poland carrying the practical lessons of Vimy Heights, remembering what a determined people in defensible terrain could accomplish against a professional army. In 1794, he led a national uprising against Russian and Prussian occupation. It was ultimately defeated, but it became a foundational event in Polish identity that endures today. Lafayette returned to France as a living embodiment of the American experiment. The French officers who had served in America came home having witnessed a successful popular revolution. Their experience shaped French intellectual life as the 1780s turned into 1789. Lafayette helped draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, drawing directly on the American Declaration. The war that Saratoga helped to make was larger and more turbulent than anyone who fought there could have imagined. But what if the events turned differently? let's go and look at our last section of the road not taken. Most battles decides who owned a field. Saratoga decided whether the nation would exist, whether France would enter the war, whether the ideas born in 1776, popular sovereignty, constitutional government, the right to throw off a violating power would live long enough to matter. These fights sat on a hinge, and let's follow them at least 3 times. What if Germain had coordinated his generals? In the winter of 1776, Germain approves 2 plans and never writes the sentence that binds them. In our world, Howe sails south, Burgoyne marches alone. In the other world, Germain writes the letter. Howe marches north, 20,000 veterans face Gates at Bemis Heights. Kosciuszko's lines are formidable, yet they're not infinite. A force that large can absorb the losses of the approach and find the flank. Albany fails, the Hudson is sealed, New England is cut off. There is no Saratoga to send to Paris. Vergennes keeps waiting for proof that never comes, no alliance, no French fleet, no Yorktown. The war grinds toward some negotiated settlement. The declaration survives as a text. Whether the nation it declared survives is another question entirely. All of it because one minister did or did not write one clear sentence. What if Fraser had survived October 7th in mid-afternoon? The British right is bending, but Simon Fraser is everywhere, rallying, riding, holding the flank by force of presence. Morgan sends his best marksmen up a tree. In our world, the shot finds its mark. In the other world, it doesn't. Fraser reaches the Bremen redoubt in time, steadies the fight, and gives Burgoyne the daylight to withdraw in order. The sortie is bloodied, not broken. There is no surrender on October 17. The courier who reaches Paris in December carries news of a British retreat, not a capitulation. Vergennes waits. The chain breaks. And then in our last hypothetical question, what if Arnold had stayed in his tent? In our world, the shot finds Fraser, the right collapses, and Benedict Arnold stripped of command, packed to leave, confined for 10 days, hears the guns and mounts anyways. His unauthorized charge drives through the gap and smashes Bremen's redoubt before dark. Momentum becomes irreversible. In the other world, he obeys orders. He stays seated, without the drive through the gap. Balcar holds, Bremen stands, the British right survives the day. There is no total collapse, no capitulation to electrify Paris. The chain breaks again. From this hillside to the Chesapeake to the Treaty of Paris. And this counterfactual carries a sting that history never lets go. 3 years after Saratoga, Arnold will attempt to surrender West Point to the British, the most notorious act of treason in American history. If he stays in his tent on October 7th, he is a footnote, a capable, embittered officer who missed the decisive fight. Maybe he defects earlier, maybe later. Maybe the anger eventually cools and the story ends differently. We cannot know. We only know that the men who may have saved the revolution also tried to destroy it. And the margin between those 2 roles was a horse, a log tent, and a choice made in a heartbeat. That is what it means for history to turn on a hinge. Not the armies, not the kings, not the tidy plans drafted in London offices. Those set the stage, but stage is not the play. The play is a quill that moves or doesn't, a bullet that finds its mark or doesn't, a man who mounts or doesn't. We tell ourselves it was inevitable. Of course, the revolution succeeded. Of course, France came to our aid. Of course, the old empire could not hold. Saratoga says otherwise. It says history turns on rifle shots. disobeyed orders, and letters that arrived too late. The road now taken still whispers from those woods. What might have been, we will never know. What was, that is enough to astonish. Next time, June 18th, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte has escaped from Elba, rebuilt his army, and marched north into Belgium. 100 days of frantic diplomacy and desperate mobilization come down to a single afternoon on a ridge south of Brussels. Waterloo, how one decision ended an era and how close we came to a very different result. Well, ladies and gents, thank you very much for following up so far in this series. I appreciate all of you. I will see you next time in our next episode. Bye.